are working through the Gospel of Mark, and we have been spending our time looking at different sections in each chapter, but I also wanted you to see, at least to some degree, as we can work through it, that there's a framework to a gospel, that it's not just a collection of random stories, that a gospel writer puts these situations and stories back to back in a particular order for a particular reason, for a particular set of circumstances, just to bring out a point that he's trying to make. And hopefully we'll see that again today as we look at something that took place in a famous event in Mark 14. I don't know how many of you were living in Muskoka in 2010. I'm sure many of you were, but there was a bit of a controversy, if that's the right word, I'm not sure. During the time that the G8 summit was up here in Huntsville, there was in some point, in some place, they built a fake lake. Do you remember that? It was in the news, and the G8 came and they saw this. I guess they couldn't go out to a real lake. I don't know if it was a problem of, security issue or whatever. They spent $1.9 million on this thing, from what I understand, and that was quite a controversy at the time. I remember in the news and watching it. I was living down south, but everybody was talking about this fake lake. And everybody in the south thought it was hilarious. Why would they do that? So stupid. Do you know why they make a big deal out of something like that? I'm not trying to get political here. I'm not trying to make a statement whether this was right or wrong. Just don't miss the forest for the trees here. I'm just trying to say, sometimes when things are done with extravagance, people have a question about them. Sometimes it seems a little strange and out of place. When something is done that seems to be a little over the top, it catches other people's attention. And they tend to wonder, what's the deal with that? Well, that is exactly what Mark is drawing out in the story that we want to look at this morning. And as I've read to you already, although we're going to be looking in chapter 14 at the passage that we would label Jesus anointed at Bethany, I want to begin with the passage that I read to you already in Mark chapter 12. It's a little strange little picture of extravagance that caught people's attention. He sat opposite the treasury, verse 41, watched the people putting money into the offering box. Now, this was a public thing that people did in the temple. This was a place where you could go, and it was unfortunate that many rich people put sums. How would they know that? Because they would drop in one coin at a time. And they would make sure that everybody heard how much was going in. They did this oftentimes in an ostentatious way for the purposes of their own self-fulfillment. And people look at me, look who I am, look what I've done. And so this was not always the case, but often the case. And Jesus had some controversy and some conflict with the Pharisees and scribes. And now he's gone and he sat down beside the treasury and he's watching this happen. Many rich people put in large sums. And a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. This Greek word here is lepton. It means thin. It means small. We don't actually know the denomination. We don't know how to translate that into our 21st century Canadian funds. The translators here have said which make a penny. I read a commentary this week that said it would have been equal to $1. It doesn't matter. The point is, in the great scheme of things, it didn't seem like much. It doesn't matter how much, because it's what the act was that Jesus draws our attention to. So she didn't put in a lot as comparison to everybody else. And when he called his disciples to him, he said to them, "Truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box." Wait, what? How does that make any sense? These people are making a big show. They're getting in this line. They're waiting their turn. They're clinking in all these coins. And this widow finally comes up and goes, clink, and walks away. And Jesus says, she put in more. Verse 44, they contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. Oh, that'll catch your attention. If you had $10,000 and you put $1,000 into the offering plate, well, thank you very much, but you have given 10%. But if you in all the world only have $1 to your name, and you put $1 in the offering plate, then you have given 100%. Jesus has an entirely different set of values when it comes to the way we look at giving. He's not interested in how much. He's looking at sacrifice. He's not interested in what it looks like to the exterior. He is looking at the heart attitude. He sees that this woman gave out of the abundance of her own heart. This clearly was an act that would have said, I'm surrendering my life to God. What hope do I have? I'm throwing myself on your mercy. God, I'm a widow. I'm looking to you to supply my need. This woman clearly in her act was expressing her own heart, her willingness to sacrifice all she was. This is not a sermon on offerings this morning by any stretch, but it's a sermon about sacrifice. As he came out of the temple, this is verse 1, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." That's the verse that follows what we just read. Does that seem like a sudden change in subject matter? Like just drop this woman and on to the next thing. Do you see what happened? These disciples heard what Jesus had said to them, that sacrifice comes from the heart, and I'm looking for sacrifice that spills out everything. I'm looking for sacrifice that isn't half-hearted. I'm looking for sacrifice that comes from the depths of you and the love for God, and you give all that you are, and that was cutting it really close. I mean, that goes right to their hearts, and the depth of what Jesus was saying was probably overwhelming. And so one of them, like every good Canadian would, just kind of changes the subject. Oh, look what wonderful stones. How about this beautiful building? That's what I see going on. Just like we would say, oh, how about that weather, eh? Isn't that funny? How the weather changes the way, I mean, that's all we go to. Talk about the hockey game, talk about anything. As soon as something cuts to the quick, change the subject. So you know chapter 13, we talked about that last time we were together, and Jesus answers this question, not one stone will be left upon another, all will be thrown down, and he begins to talk about some future events. So we have this story of this woman in the temple. There is a bookend to that woman being sacrificially giving out of nothing. There's another woman who responds in a different way, and Mark, again, in his literary style, puts these two pictures of two women who are giving extravagantly on bookends between an event. Let me give you Mark 14, verse 1. Now, it was 2 days before the Passover. This is setting the stage now. 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. I'm not trying to insult your intelligence. I'm quite sure many of you are well aware of the Passover. It was the last of the 10 plagues. The angel of death came and passed over every house that was covered by blood after the 10th plague, and they were rescued. And this was an annual event that took place to commemorate God's deliverance from them out of slavery from Egypt. Every year they met for Passover. Immediately following Passover was the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This was a feast that lasted for 7 days, and it was commemorating the wandering through the wilderness and God's provision of manna in the wilderness. And so this is a big event. The reason that Mark is putting this in here is so that readers, like ourselves who need to have this explained because we're non-Jewish readers, would have to recognize that this is now a significant and serious time of the year when Jerusalem is jam-packed with tourists. I mean, we live in tourist country, but nothing like Passover season in Jerusalem would have been. Everybody and their uncle and their uncle's uncle would have been crammed into your house if you were any relation, if you could afford an inn. They were there. It was a requirement after a certain age to be at Passover. So 2 days before Passover, there is starting to be a buzz in Jerusalem. People are doing their shopping. They're getting their stuff ready. They know it means that the markets are going to close. They know that family are coming. Everything is ramping up. And the chief priests and the scribes were seeking to arrest him by stealth and kill him. This is Mark's little beginning of the end. We know the end result. Clearly, you're familiar with the cross and how things take place. And clearly, this is for the benefit of all of mankind. At the death of Christ, he is our ultimate sacrifice that brings us the forgiveness of sins before a holy God. needless to say, from their perspective, they just wanted done with him. For they said, they had to do this by stealth, for they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people. So there's this little background that's taking place of Jesus' hatred is building, and his death is imminent, and it's coming and building, and the pressure is rising, and the reason it isn't happening right now is just because all of the people that are in Jerusalem, for the most part, they favor Jesus. They see him as a possibility of a genuine Messiah. Excuse me. So, quickly now, to another little vignette. Takes us into a house in Bethany. Bethany is a village 2 miles from Jerusalem. Jesus and his disciples were most likely traveling down towards the Passover, towards Jerusalem. They stop at the house of Simon the leper. This would probably be better said Simon the former leper. If Simon was a leper, they wouldn't be stopping at his house and having dinner. We don't know who he was. We know nothing about him. That's all we know. We know from the Gospel of John, in John 12, that Mary and Martha and Lazarus are also at this feast, this gathering. Whether she is helping him with the meal, we don't know. But there's a gathering of people, and they're sitting, reclining at table. Reclining because that is the position that they took when they ate in the ancient Near East. You lean on an elbow, you put your feet out to the side, and you eat with your right hand. A woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard. Does anyone here know what nard is? I always think of lard when I hear the word nard. Nard is not lard. Just for the sake of it, I copy-pasted out of Wikipedia, which basically means this is 100% accurate, and you have no worries that there's any mistakes in any of this. I didn't know what it was either fully, so I just thought I'd show you. Spikenard, also called nard, nardin, and muskroot, is a class of aromatic amber-colored essential oil derived from, and you can pronounce that if you would like, a flowering plant of the valerian family. I think we had some neighbors who were Valerians. From the valerian family, which grows in the Himalayas of Nepal, China, and India. Now you know what I know. It is an essential oil that is derived from a plant. It is very fragrant, and from my understanding, it is used to this day in various perfumes and ointments and things. It has a pleasant scent, apparently. And it is extremely challenging to extract this, especially in the first century, which made it a very expensive thing. If you don't mind my little mind taking you down a rabbit trail, I'm too silly sometimes, but as I was just thinking about this through this week, it struck me that nard, we never hear the word nard on a perfume bottle because that is just a marketing failure right there. Here, honey, I brought you some nard. It's just not going to go anywhere. So I just was thinking about that. It made me think about the fact that we never, pick these and give them to our wives. What is it? It's bloodwort. Here, honey. Like we know how to do things right. We don't, anyway, so, I'm sorry. It's just a rabbit trail my mind went down. So it's in an alabaster jar, which is what? Alabaster, for those of you who I'm sure are familiar, but maybe not, it is a soft stone that is carved into an object, like soapstone, sometimes like marble. It is hard, sometimes translucent, but not super hard stone. And it can be used and has been used for centuries. In fact, this artifact is found in a museum. The 1621 at the bottom is not the year. This is actually dated approximately 1,500 years before Christ, the time of Christ. This is a museum piece, and that's the number on it. It would most likely, they have done this for centuries, used alabaster jars to hold precious oils and precious things. And they would put a wax top in the top of it. They would seal it so that it basically you couldn't get at what was inside of it. It would hold the fragrance or hold the essential oil, whatever's in there. And so the curiosity is, why would this woman, Mary, we know from, she's not mentioned in Mark, but in John we know that it's Mary, as in Mary and Martha. Why would this woman have a jar of alabaster jar of nard? Now that you know what an alabaster jar of nard is, why would she have this thing? Well, We don't know, clearly the text doesn't tell us, but we do know from history, we have some good guesses. It was likely that this would have been perhaps an heirloom, something that had been passed down for generations in the household. It could have been saved up as a dowry. That is a highly likely possibility. Or perhaps it would have been kept for the death of a loved one. Because as someone dies, that's what they did in the first century, they ladled their body, if that's the word, with all kinds of fragrances and flowers and herbs and different things as you wrap the body. You're probably familiar with that, as they did with Jesus' body. So this would have represented for her something that hadn't happened yet. She was a single woman, and clearly she was alive. So whatever, if you want to look at it this way, this bottle represented her future. Whatever it was, whatever it could be, whatever her dreams of getting married, whatever she thought about her funeral would look like, whatever was coming down the road, she had no idea. But this bottle represented something important. And we know, in fact, that it was important as we continue the text. I'm sure you're familiar with this. Well, he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper. He was reclining at table. A woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. Wait a second. What is she doing? There were some who said to themselves indignantly, why was this ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than, now we get the sense of how much we're talking, 300 denarii. Now that would only be familiar to you if you've been paying attention when I walk through these New Testament phrases. A denarii, class, is how much, class? 1 day's wage. Good for you. 1 day's wage. And if you, that's a typical day's wage as for a laborer. If you owned your own business and nobody's buying your candy apples, then maybe you wouldn't make that much. But generally speaking, that's how much you made in a day. So let's do some math. There's 300 1 day's wage. We can't do the math on what it is to that to there. Different cultures, different times, different, exchange rates. We don't know how much it was, but it was a lot of money. A lot of money. I looked up how many work days are there in a year in Canada. Do you know the answer? This year in 2019, there are 261 work days if you take out the holidays and the weekends. So this is more than 1 year's wage to a Canadian. Whatever your wage is, put that in a bottle. And this woman comes, snaps it open, and pours it on his head. That would get someone's attention. That seems a little extravagant. We still do extravagant things, by the way, with perfumes and such. Clive Christian Imperial Majesty perfume, long name, but you'll notice the word nard is nowhere found in its title. Very wise. This perfume sells for over $12,000 per ounce, just in case you're interested and you want to get some for your wee wife. She better not be wee. And if you want to buy that entire bottle, it is $215,000. Now, how would that feel to you if you saw somebody buy that bottle at Hudson's Bay counter, walk from the cash register, pull the top off, and pour it over somebody's head? Would that get your attention? That's what's going on. These people are flabbergasted. Do you know how much money that is? And you just did that? That is so wasteful. That is so extravagant. Read the text again. There were some who said to themselves indignantly. So this is not just one person. All of the disciples are murmuring, and it's building. Why was this ointment wasted? Look at the end of the text. They scolded her. You foolish woman. Grab it quick. They're in panic. What are you doing? Now, you know what John tells us? John tells us a little insight that Mark doesn't. It was Judas who spoke verbally on behalf of all the disciples who were murmuring among themselves. Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" He said this, not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. That is why it is seen as a waste. Because I could have got something from that. You're wasting it because I could have benefited from that. That looks foolish to me because you could have given me something. And as long as that's the vision of it, it will always seem like a waste. Whenever you pour out something for God, whenever you pour out your life before Christ, whenever you sacrifice yourself, somebody is always going to see it as a waste. J.C. Ryle, first bishop, Anglican bishop, evangelical of Liverpool, in his little book, the commentary to Mark, he says this about this text: there is never wanting a generation of people who decry what they call extremes in religion. They are incessantly recommending what they term moderation in the service of Christ. If a man devotes his time to money and affection, to the pursuit of worldly things, they do not blame him. If he gives himself up for the service of money, pleasure, or politics, they find no fault. But if the same man devotes himself and all that he has to Christ, they can scarcely find words to express their sense of his folly. He is beside himself. He's out of his mind. He's a fanatic. He's an enthusiast. He is righteous over much. He's an extreme man. In short, they regard it as a waste. That is exactly what we see to this day. There can be people that feel themselves called to a mission field to pour out their lives in a country and fill in the blank. And they go off to Europe or Africa or Asia or whatever they do, and perhaps they're risking their lives to do so. And what does their family say? What does the church sometimes say? What are you doing? Don't you see that there's people here in Canada that need the Lord? You don't have to go and spill yourself out there. What a waste. You have so much time and so much talent, so much before you. You could serve here. What a waste. I'll tell you what, when you go into the ministry, this is just from my experience, that is a very common response that you get. And the worst of it is becoming all the more common, my humble opinion, within the Christian church even itself. That if a young person decides that they feel called to serve the Lord, heaven forbid that any one of us should not allow them to pour out their sacrifice to the full. If that is in their heart to do, why would we stand in anyone's way of serving God with all that they are, with all that they know? If they feel called to this work. I know this from my own experience. Young man, you step into the idea of going to Bible school, they pat you on the head like, oh, well, good luck. You're never going to be getting anywhere. You're never going to do anything. You're never going to, fine, whatever. I don't care if I die doing this. I feel this is the thing I have to do. It doesn't matter to me what the end result is. I'm going to do this thing. We'll just find what happens. I lived for 2 years, starved to death. Let's bring it on. Let's do this. That is the heart attitude of someone who knows that they're called to something. And the church to this day comes out and tells us, be quiet, settle down. It's such a waste. People, do you know why it's such a waste to you? Maybe you're not in that category, and fine if you're not. Do you know why it seems like a waste? Because it's showing you up. Because you think you could get something better. You've got the spirit that Judas had. You can't let this go. You can't let this happen. You can't give up your life. This is the reason you're not even willing to sacrifice your own life and your own time. I'm not reprimanding you. I'm not trying to rebuke anybody. I'm just trying to tell you what the text says. If the pew fits, wear it. I'm just saying. Some people in the church, you ask them to serve, and they couldn't pour out their lives for anything. They wouldn't give you more time in their already busy schedule of watching television every evening or whatever they've got going on that's so important. Pardon my sarcasm. They couldn't give you more of something else because they couldn't pour out another drop because they're so full of holding on to their own flask. And Christ calls us to pour out our lives for the sake of the gospel, every one of us, to give all that we know and all that we have for one purpose, for his kingdom and his glory. That's the call of the gospel. The call of the gospel is, you come and follow me, you die to yourself, you die to your dreams, you pour your life out, and you become swallowed up in me. And I become you. I live through you. I do my work through you. As you die, you will live, because I will be seen in your life. That's not the Canadian way. We are all about comfort, ease, politeness. I mean, should we talk about the bricks in the buildings now? Are we starting to feel uncomfortable? This is what Jesus is saying to these disciples. He's rebuking them. Jesus said, leave her alone. By the way, this is in aorist tense. That means stop it now. It's immediate. Don't keep doing this. Don't berate her. Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? This is a rebuke. She has done a beautiful thing. They are completely puzzled. This was extravagance, foolish extravagance, foolishness. Why would you spend money and blow money like that for that? You always have the poor, Jesus said. You always have the poor. By the way, Jesus is just simply quoting Deuteronomy 15, verse 11. He's reminding them what the Old Testament law said. For there will never cease to be poor in the land. Therefore I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy, to the poor in your land. The law, the Old Testament law, made provision for the poor. The poor represented an ongoing opportunity and an obligation to serve God, to serve others, to help other people. This is what the poor were to do. You always have the poor. You're always not taking away from that. Don't make excuses. You're always going to be able to do that. Jesus said, leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She's done a beautiful thing to me, for you will always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them. But you will not always have me. Jesus, in this instance, was a one-time opportunity. It's the only time he's there. Martha knew the end somehow, or whatever the case. The end was near. This was not going to be always here. I want to respond to him. I want to pour out. I want to show something of how I feel about him. I want to respond in some way to his burial and all that he's done for me. I know what I'll do. I'll grab my dowry. I'll grab that anointing oil. It doesn't matter to me that it's expensive. And I'm going to anoint him with it. Now we know from John's gospel, some of it trickled down, and she got on her knees and wiped his feet with her hair to wipe off the oil. And this was, of course, completely immodest and inappropriate, but this is what the situation was. Jesus says, she has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, that's an interesting little sentence, sort of an aside, but Jesus somehow seemed to think an awful lot of where his gospel was going to go. But here he is with his 12 little guys and a little tiny band, and in the great scheme of things, really nobody knew who he was. And here he's claiming now that the whole world is going to hear about this. That's a big statement. It's exactly what has happened. Wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. Is that correct? Well, duh. Here we are talking about it now. More than 2,000 years later. To this day, she's being talked about. Because what she did is indicative of what we should do and who we should be and how we should be before this Christ. Mark 14. When Judas, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. And he sought an opportunity to betray him. Judas followed Christ looking for what would benefit him. He followed him because he knew that he got free food, he was taken care of, he had a nice fat money bag that occasionally he could dip into. And there came a point when he said to himself, the gig is up. I'm done with this Jesus. I want nothing to do with him. He only followed him in as far as it suited him. There are still people who hang around Jesus with the very same attitude. They're only around as long as the getting is good. But the moment the culture starts to encroach on your thought of having to actually stand out for Christ or stand up for him, I just betray him. There's always Judases. There are always those who are willing to turn their back on him. Who are you this morning? Just as a literary device, I'll just remind you what Mark did here. He's got bookends. There's a woman who comes in, and she, with extravagance, gives everything she has, 100%. That catches everyone's attention. She gave more than everybody else. What? Because she gave from her heart of everything she had to live on. It's amazing. This is not about you giving your bank account. I'm not asking you to do that. Please don't do that. You just become a burden to us and society and everyone else. This is about giving 100% from your heart. And then on the other end of this is another woman who is not poor. She's quite wealthy. She has something of great value. And what does she do? Extravagance. She pours it out and wastes it in the eyes of those who are watching her. And between these are another set of bookends. Seeking to arrest him, they with stealth try to plan to kill him. And on the other side of this event, you have this greedy Judas who's willing to receive 30 pieces of silver to turn his back and make sure he dies. There is a structure within the Gospels when they're written. And if you're careful when you read them, you'll see that Mark, all of the Gospel writers, are putting things together in a purposeful order to help us to see the events as they unfold and put them together in a way that makes us see a bigger picture of something that's taking place. And in the middle of this, there is this little, perfect, quiet little place in Bethany where a strange little event takes place. Matthew 10, verse 39. Whoever finds his life will lose it. And whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. If you've never surrendered your life to Christ, you're clinging to your own life because you think you got a better idea on how to live your life. You've never given up yourself. You don't know what it is to live until you're ready to die. Do you know what it is to live until you are dead to yourself? And you need to come to Christ and surrender your life, your heart, your dreams, your future, your sin, all that you are. Surrender it and give it up and make him the king of your life. This is where life is found. Oh, how often we don't believe that. How often we think life is found in our own pleasures and our own dreams and our own thoughts. The call of the gospel is to pour yourself out. Pour your life out before a Christ who will give you life. This is the gospel of Mark.